think I mean, I think there's some really good picks. I think there's some insane picks. They all are disruptors and people that are going to blow shit up. And I am in favor of that. And I think most people are in favor of these people, and they failed us. And I think when you look at the city and stuff, is that okay? Like the same class of people and the same kind of talking heads and the same kind of TV personalities. And taxes are high. I can't really use public transportation. People are shitting on the streets, and I've got to get some motherfucker to open up the cabinet so I can buy deodorant at CVS, and it drives you crazy. Not some motherfucker, but it's like trying to find that person.
Yeah.
Well, Marissa's on break. Hold on, I want to buy. I want to buy a $3 fucking thing of deodorant. I don't want to turn it into a career.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of frustration.
Yeah. I'm not a fucking socialist by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, you started a company and believe in profit motive. But when I've looked at kind of some of the statistics that have been presented in the retail industry, I think shrinkage, which is lost and stolen goods, is like 60 billion a year. Hasn't really moved that much, even though we think it has, because it got so much attention during COVID. It raised a couple of billion. But did you know that every year and this is tracked by the Department of Labor, the amount of wage theft by those companies is over $70 billion a year?
I believe it.
I think
totally believe it.
100%. And I think this is why I go back to AOC a lot. And I think why Bernie Sanders could have beaten Trump in 2016 is that, I think it matters what kind of disruption happens. And I actually don't know that you can disrupt a government, a bureaucracy. I think it's extremely difficult. But if I were to select the disruptors that are going to prevent the 70-something billion dollars or, paying overtime, it wouldn't be the president that bragged about not paying overtime. It wouldn't be the president who bragged about not paying overtime with the billionaire who's the richest man on earth that he lauded for firing people because they wanted to unionize in one of his car factories. I think there is a irrational, incongruous thinking in the process where the idea is it doesn't matter where you throw the Molotov cocktail as long as you throw the Molotov cocktail. And I say it actually matters where you throw it. Chris, we are the day before Thanksgiving. Trump has a lot to be thankful for. Kamala did her best to be thankful in a 10-minute video that I saw on Instagram. Where do you want to start? You want to tell us, what are your thoughts? Did you see the full video of Kamala?
Yeah. It was part of like a Zoom thing.
Yeah.
And the greatest comment I saw on it online was that she should have been doing that with a glass of wine and smoking Virginia Slims at the time, because it would have been. And again, I mean, everybody's saying.
Actually saw an edited video. I saw an edited video where they edited in a bottle of like Jack Daniels in her hand, to your point.
I mean, she sounds hammered. I'm not going to say she was, but it was not like, and again, I mean, here's the thing. It's like, if you want to get hammered after you lose an election, God only knows I did that. But, the election's been over a month, and you're the fucking vice president of the United States, and the president is insentient. So maybe you would like to sober up, and if somebody launches missiles. Again, I kind of get it. I mean, what are you going to do? I'm going to go get Blotto for a week. Okay, I kind of get it. And the whole weird morning thing is kind of bizarre.
Yeah.
I mean, God only knows. I mean, literally, I lost hundreds of races, and it stinks, and it sucks. By the way, I was doing California 13, 185.
Except 50. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It was like 100 votes or something difference right now, right?
Yeah. And I'm kind of pessimistic because what's remaining are kind of cured ballots. And again, the process has taken so long. I think it's 0.008. And, so I'm kind of pessimistic about it. But again, It's things. It sucks. But you
And I
kind
think
of
this is actually the first thing that she's lost, right? Like, I think she's never really, I mean, other than dropping out of the primary, but she didn't really lose that. She withdrew. I think this is the first time she's actually lost, which probably, she's not accustomed to it.
yeah. And on the other side of it is that you only did it for 3 months. I mean, it's not like, you know, I don't know if you're Hillary Clinton and you've been running for fucking 2 decades and then you lose that, like, I get being bitter, but but that's
On the other hand, I can only imagine like that national adoration that you feel when you're running for president, and then it gets taken away from you. What a vicious bitch that is! Like, to be able to peek behind the curtain and see what it would be like, and then have that taken away, and that was your one shot.
what's always funny is that, like, a lot of times, probably Trump won't, but a lot of times on election day, the loser will be on the dais too. The look on their face when they're trying to be like smile and be happy, and it's just like kind of go, oh my,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
yeah.
Good. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that's a really interesting thing. What did you think of the dynamic between Biden and Trump when they met in the Oval? I heard somebody say something, and it's something that I thought, and I hesitate to say it this way, but it's like somebody said online, a couple of days ago, this guy was the end of democracy, and now you're just shaking hands with him in the Oval Office. And there is a bit of a boy who cried wolf aspect to this that I think people, and it's the same thing that is the argument that's been made on the right about overclaiming like everything's racist. Well, then you delegitimize when there are legitimately racist things that happen. If this person is legitimately a threat to democracy, you've delegitimized it by just acting like it's a normal transition.
You know,
You've
I agree.
delegitimized that argument.
And I think that, not to make less important January 6th and all the legal battles and all the shit they try to get overturned and over all that, hyperbole, 8 years, kind of going, enough already. This guy's mainstreamed it.
Yeah.
And I think that there is some of that. And I'm not sure, it's just fatigue. I mean, you can only say that so many times. And here he is on, here he is on CBS, here he is on CNN. I mean,
I think this gets to the branding issue for Democrats as well. The number of people that I think are inherently prone to be Democrat supporters that have said how weak the Democrats are as partisans goes back to kind of why I think people are looking for, why did Trump win? I think because people view Democrats as pawns. They view them as servants to bigger issues, whereas they see him as willing to fight other people. Whereas, there's this argument that Donald Trump is going to try to subvert the FBI background check process and the advise and consent role of the Senate by forcing into recess and applying it and putting people in that he wants in and doing private corporate background checks instead of FBI. And I saw somebody say, what Biden should do is every name that has been put forth by Trump, he should have them run an FBI check on them right now. Now, we could say the norm of that, bad optics, what the fuck do they have to lose at this point? It's like, start throwing some right hook haymakers and show that you're in the fight rather than just these pawns. And I don't know what you think of that, but it kind of all gels together in this overall branding issue that I think Democrats have.
I think there's a couple things at play, and I think this team did a test yesterday or the day before, which I refer to as a modern reading of the Telltale Heart, and everybody forgets their Poe. The Telltale Heart is a famous Poe short story. Narrators talking about this murder, and you realize like halfway through the story that the person is fucking crazy, absolutely criminally insane. And what this podcast sounded like to me. Uh, One of the problems the Democrats have institutionally, which kind of will lead us to in the content of that podcast, so successful from '08 through '12. They had two presidentials, they had the House back and forth, but they controlled really all levels of government. And functionaries, like the people who were on that podcast, very rich by either working for super PACs or NGOs or, I mean, if I know George Soros is supposed to be the Republican Satan, but, he funded the America podcast, and if he wants to fund ours, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Chris Matola, corporate whores, we all know. They're wildly successful. And the Hillary thing was kind of a shock to the system. But they all went, oh, it's an anomaly, and it's Russia, it's this, it's that, it's that. And they had a great 2012, or I'm sorry, 2018. They kind of pulled everything back, and you kind of go, okay, Trump was the anomaly. And then they win in 20, and you kind of go, okay, Trump was the anomaly. And there was not a big red wave in 22. And they go, okay, that Trump was the anomaly. And then all of a sudden you lose all three, pieces of government. And actually, not pieces of government. You lose the House, the Senate, and see. And as opposed to saying, oh, this is the anomaly and making excuses for this, it's been this kind of about boiling a frog. How do you boil a frog? You boil it really slow temperature. Yeah. And this is what's really been happening, is that the boiling temperature's gotten higher and higher. And, when you look at the shifts across the country, Trump and Republicans, it's a repudiation of Democrats. And I think it's because it's fat and happy from their professional class. Everybody was fat and happy in their professional class. They talk to too many people in the media who kind of bought into their narrative. And if you are a Republican operative like me or the people in the Trump campaign, you had your teeth kicked in for a decade and were massively outspent, and you couldn't get a break, like media coverage, or not. But I mean, said that was kind of they're going to get a good shake on CNN or something. Created this entire other ecosystem developed. Republicans developed it. I think they exploited it first. They went, oh, okay, well, here and talk to voters. And I think that tactically, when you listen to the podcast, we're in the fucking dark ages. I mean, when you listen to the podcast, either they're outright lying or they still have no idea what kind of bus hit them.
You raise a really good point, because to go back to how we started this with the Kamala video, there's a whole section there where she talks about how they raised $1.4 billion. We raised $8 million in funds of $56 or less. And it struck me that following one of our podcasts in our newsletter, we sent out and we said in there that Democrats think the game is who raises the most money, but it isn't. It's who gets the most votes. I couldn't fathom bragging about how much money you raised when you lost the popular vote even. So yes, it's funny how you frame that, because rightly or wrongly, Democrats have inherited this scarlet letter of working for the billionaire class, mostly from the recession of '08. And nobody went to jail. Nobody was held accountable. People lost their homes. I think that's where it all comes from. I think all of this is a residual hangover from the war on terror, Occupy Wall Street, and the what's the right wing version of Occupy Wall Street? The Tea Party. I think that group has coalesced, and they hate the Democrats because the Democrats inherited that and tried to solve all of it. The way they solved it, however, benefited the rich people and did not benefit the middle and lower classes. So if you are a Democrat and you're doing all these things trying to keep the economy together, which is maybe structurally not as strong as we think it is, so they're doing all these things to try to keep it together, and you're pleasing your mega donors and you're raising a ton of money, it's easy to believe, not even just winning elections, but it's easy to believe, oh, we raised so much money, people believe in us. Then you believe that you're actually making progress. And to your point, what you said very astutely, super wise last week, what Republicans and what the Trump campaign in particular realize is that there are people that have checked out from the entire process because they're actually, I would say they're populists and they hate both sides and they were gettable. And you can't get them if you're seen as the enemy. And for populists, the enemy are not Democrat or Republican. It is a class war. And whoever can play themselves into that, then they are the winner.
That's absolutely correct. And what I found remarkable about that podcast, you mentioned before, he was a data targeting guy, super duper fucking crazy smart, Tim Saylor. Out, he said, listen, he said, we released surveys that said exactly what the electorate was and exactly where it was going. And everybody said, no, that's not it. This is gaslighting. And at the American Association of Political Consultants conference 2 weeks ago now, Rizia, the lead pollster for the Trump campaign, said, this is what we did. And what you exactly said, they went out and they found people who were neither Republican or Democrat, neither Trump nor Harris, but were pissed off, and they persuaded them to come out and vote for Trump. And that was the election. Not election, but that was a giant chunk. And that's where all their advertising was designed to go. The Harris people talking about that they then was targeted for black people in Georgia, in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, but white people saw it too. I mean, the lack of the lack of discernment about what actually happened is shocking for being, a top tier guy. And again, one of the things that, I kind of had the advantage of and a lot of, and I'm assuming that the Democrats had a version of it, was a dashboard. You load it up on your screen, and literally you can watch the media buys going on anywhere in the country. And when you click on it, you can actually find the advertising that's being run. This for more than 20 seconds. See, advertising on Hallmark Channel on trans issues. They're stupid or they're really smart. So what do we know about people who view the Hallmark Channel issues? Well, wait a minute, shouldn't they be our voters? And certain things should kind of dawn on you. And it's really clear that they didn't, or they're just kind of spinning. And I mean, we've gone from she ran a perfect campaign last week to unwinnable this week. I get it, but the whole thing is US or I have friends that are most of my good friends are actually Democrat consultants, and they were telling me exactly this shit. And the problems with it. I mean, the fact that over a month out, I'll use his name because he's kind of tired and out of the business. Neil Oxman, who is kind of the dean of Pennsylvania media consultants, and he said to me, he said there's going to be 50,000 less black voters in Philadelphia than there were in 2020, and the Harris people are in denial about it.
Right.
It was like over a month out that he said that. And when you look at election day, then Tim Saylor, again, Trump's data guy, he kind of posted yesterday, he said that, the weekend before the votes came in, they could tell from the early votes that she was going to underperform in Philadelphia by about 50,000 votes. And so you kind of go this wasn't fucking rocket science because, a Democrat consultant saw it almost a month and a half out, and everybody knew it. But I get you running a big campaign, but you need Pennsylvania.
What's really actually to get to the core, I think, of what the problem may be for Democrats. And I don't think it's actually just Democrats. I think just right now they're having their kind of come to Jesus moment because they lost. But the fact that all of these consultants from the Harris campaign, these insiders, went on Pod Save America to explain why they lost, as if they would fucking know why they lost. Pod Save America should actually be out on the streets in Philly, in Dearborn, in other places, asking people why the Harris campaign lost, because that's how you're going to find it out. I learned a ton We talked before about how AOC polled her voters, her constituents, or her followers on her Instagram. She said, hey, for everyone who voted for me and for Trump, I'd like to know why, right? That prompted some people to go out on the street in the Bronx in her district and do man on the street interviews. That feedback is not the same thing you're getting from Pluff and those others on that Pod Save America. You're getting very different answers. And that's the real reason they lost. This Pod Save America with these people talking, all it is, the tenured professors sitting in a circle telling each other how their students are learning. You don't know because you're not talking to your students. It's interesting. The reason I say that, to just add on to this point, what struck me, remember when we talked about Dan Osborne in Nebraska running a good campaign? He ran as an independent, but a union guy, obviously probably a Democrat, right? So there was this chart that was posted of all the Senate Democrats running in this cycle, ranked against Harris's performance. Dan Osborne overperformed her by the most, 7.6%. Now, granted, they both lost in Nebraska, but I guess she won the Nebraska second or whatever it is. But it isn't this running away from liberal, even somewhat quasi-socialist economic things that I've heard people say, we need to move to the middle. We need to move to the middle. It has nothing to do with political middle. It has to do with the economics. I think that's why he did so well. And that shocked me that he overperformed the most. By the way, second was John Tester. Tell me that's not fucking shocking.
And normally, again, having done this on the other side, we kind of have these kind of wipeout states and stuff. 6 to 8 points ahead at the top of the ticket is fucking massive. But plus, which I've had to do a couple times on campaigns, it's I wouldn't say it's nearly impossible, but like, you need to run a great campaign and you need to have everything break for you. And, Osborne was kind of really interesting. She kind of put the Democrats, listen to the podcast, which I think people should do because it's interesting.
They should finish our podcast first and then go listen to the
do interviews, or we did interviews and Trump was held. And it's like, we were treated unfairly and we were, get the fuck out of here. You could fly to Houston for Beyonce, but you couldn't stick around for Joe Rogan. Why you're flying to Texas to do fucking Beyonce on abortion rights is, I get it's a national audience and that's what you do because she's got that kind of power and it was probably about her schedule, not Harris's. But, it's kind of insane to say somehow that Trump hit. Harris didn't do an interview until the end of September, and she was the candidate in July. Then what she did were kind of softball things.
Yeah, I also felt that was very disingenuous on the pod, on that interview pod, where they keep talking about how they had a condensed cycle. It could just be. I accept it might just be I'm different than other people, but you can't tell me that by August people didn't know, or by after the convention, people didn't know who Kamala was. Now, I actually, to some degree, do believe that because, like we talked about before, they were trying to go through mainstream media, which can't even fathom who thought that up when everyone knows there's been over a decade of cord cutting. People are getting their information from microsites, YouTube, TikTok, all of these things, Facebook. And they may have been running a digital campaign, but they leaned heavily on these kind of like bigger mainstream things that maybe people didn't know who she was. But you can't tell me that you can't win a race in 107 days or whatever she had. If anything, it benefited her, I think, because if people had more time with her, I understand that she went up, like over time, her favorables went up and were actually higher than Trump's. But when people got to see her for a period of time, like she wasn't swaying them. You can like somebody but think they shouldn't be president.
One of the things that we talked about podcast is that so much of the Harris campaign felt like it was landlocked in 2012. On that campaign, like Dylan, Malley and campaigns, but the idea that like on 60 Minutes and think it has some kind of cachet, or we're going to go on Good Morning America, we're going to go on CNBC. What are you, fucking insane? I mean, and I get the sense from the podcast too, is that they were overwhelmed by process. And they were talking about, well, we got pushback from the ads we wanted to write from our staff. You're the fucking senior management. You say, this is the spot we're going to run. Go fuck yourself. You can quit. And there's also some kind of really interesting that I kind of, it wasn't explicit, but with the super PAC, First Forward, pitching about First Forward, because First Forward was doing other different stuff. Campaign was, and one of the things they did was things that they did, say a memo or something that said that the trans spot really hurt, and that here was the best Harris spot, and it was on the economy, what I would do on the economy, and this is the spot they didn't run, and 140 spots the last week or so. But they clearly took a shot at the Harris, and I think in this podcast, the Harris leadership kind of takes a shot back. I tend to believe the super PAC. I think that what they needed to do that they didn't was her on camera and talk about doing why she wanted to be president and why she would be a change candidate. I mean, the idea that they were scared of her, I think, for Christ's sake, Trump's been all over the board. Never.
Totally.
I was not running it, but if I was running it, I think it was pretty, because once you realized that she was not going to sell, that people thought she was too liberal and they thought she was wacky. They didn't like her on Bidenomics, they didn't like her on trans issues, and they didn't like her on border, which were, three of the more issues. By the way, they also happen to be a foreign policy issue, a cultural issue, and an economic issue. So if you're the Trump campaign, you've lined that up pretty fucking good. But once you realize that you're kind of going to lose that, it's very common and kind of almost a cliche tactic. Yeah, this is what I thought, but I've changed because facts changed. Tried something, it didn't work, but like you, I changed over time and heard you and I've listened to you. So number one, you're repudiating something they don't like, and you're kind of going like, Hitler, I was never for Hitler. You're terrible. I was, even if you're in isolation, I mean, you saw that during World War II, like all the isolationists were after the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was never that way. But then what you do is you tell the American people how smart they are. I listened to you. You're right. I mean, holy fuck, you're never going to go wrong that way. And again, it's a simple tactic. And a lot of times you get pushback from candidates and you get pushback from senior staff. We can't admit the boss made a mistake. And I'm sure there's a lot of that stuff. At a certain point, you grab the candidate and you grab a coffee or you get on a call and you say, listen, this is the only thing that's going to move numbers or you're going to lose. And 9 times out of 10, the candidate get, okay.
Do you think, in listening to you and how we've talked about this before and how we're talking about it today, I don't get the sense, tell me if I'm wrong, I don't get the sense that you're saying that Trump made a better pitch to the people that were pissed with how things are and wanted to really burn the house down in a way. I don't think he made a better pitch to them, or at least that's not what I'm hearing. But what I hear is she made no pitch. She ignored that they existed. And all he had to do was just basically show up and say, I hear you and I hate them too.
And again, I mean, because he was a terribly flawed candidate. And, he started with high negatives. And I think I said that all Trump had to do in the last couple of weeks was be normal. And all she had to do was be change. And neither of them accomplished that. If you have status quo and your choice is somebody you don't particularly care for, but who will change the status quo, what do you status quo? You go for, I'm going to take the other devil. It's not that hard of a choice. They can't.
Last week we labeled a little bit of what Trump did as retail politics. And what strikes me now in looking at that map where especially some surprising states like New York, California, New Jersey, there's this drastic move to the right. I also don't get the sense that that is a move to the right that is a sustaining identity and party affiliation. It was just a vote response. I actually think one positive thing that may be coming out of this, I don't know if it's positive or not, but one thing that may be coming out of this is a smaller and smaller percentage of people are identifying with party and are more so identifying with, I would actually say, emotional stories that are presented by candidates. I guess another way of saying that is brand. So I think the reason I would argue that that is an observation that I would stand behind is, again, the sheer number of people who split their tickets and how you could vote for Trump and AOC at the same time. There's really no world where you would think that that would be a party choice. And that's a logical solution, unless you say this has nothing to do with party. This has to do with who you think is going to tear down the structure that exists currently. You think that's right?
I think that's absolutely right. And so when you just said the AOC Trump axis, I was reminded of, and I think I probably referenced this in like 22 or in our mid 20s or something. Brilliant pollster, a guy named Pat Caddell, famous for doing Jimmy Carter's campaign in 1976. I did George McGovern's in 72. He became a national figure of his PhD dissertation. Came up with the brilliant analysis 1968 and had their top two choices for president were Robert F. Kennedy and Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
And both were populists. Both were blowing up. They came at it from, they came at it from the, left and the right, literally the AOC Trump thing, but they were the top two choices. So it's not incongruous at all. The famous Winston Churchill quote that says, "If you're going through hell, keep going." If you don't like the way things are, rhetoric that I used for years in spots was, if you're tired of the way this country's run, then change the people who run it. Tag and every change election for 20 years. By the way, to that point, I think there's some really good picks. I think there's some insane picks. All are disruptors and people that are going to blow shit up. And I am in favor of that. I think most people are in favor of these people, and they failed us. And I think when you look at the city and stuff, is that, okay, like the same class of people and the same kind of talking heads and the same kind of TV personalities. And, my taxes are high. I can't really use public transportation. People are shitting on the streets, and I've got to get some motherfucker to open up the cabinet so I can buy deodorant at CVS, and it drives you crazy. Not some motherfucker, but, it's like trying to find that person.
Yeah.
Well, this is on break. Hold on, we'll get, I a $3 fucking thing of deodorant. I don't want to turn it into a career.
Yeah.
I think that kind of frustration.
Yeah. I'm not a fucking socialist by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, you started a company and believe in profit motive. But when I've looked at kind of some of the statistics that have been presented in the retail industry, I think shrinkage, which is lost and stolen goods, is like 60 billion a year. Hasn't really moved that much, even though we think it has, because it got so much attention during COVID. It raised a couple of billion. But did you know that every year and this is tracked by the Department of Labor, the amount of wage theft by those companies is over $70 billion a year? So I think
totally believe it.
100%. And I think this is why I go back to AOC a lot. And I think why Bernie Sanders could have beaten Trump in 2016 is that, I think it matters what kind of disruption happens. And I actually don't know that you can disrupt a government, a bureaucracy. I think it's extremely difficult. But if I were to select the disruptors that are going to prevent the 70 something billion dollars or, paying overtime, it wouldn't be the president that bragged about not paying overtime. It wouldn't be the president who bragged about not paying overtime with the billionaire who's the richest man on earth that he lauded for firing people because they wanted to unionize in one of his 4 car factories. I think there is a irrational, incongruous thinking in the process where the idea is it doesn't matter where you throw the Molotov cocktail as long as you throw the Molotov cocktail. And I say it actually matters where you throw it. And you're seeing this now with like the farm, I don't know what the association is, but I'm sure you've seen in the last week or so, they're now lobbying to not deport their workers on farms. It's like they want to enforce the laws on other people, but not on themselves. I saw a woman who's an illegal immigrant, and we talked about another family that was in the same situation. She's here illegally. Her kids are citizens. They voted for Trump. They asked her, "Are you afraid of being deported?" She said, "No, they will deport the ones that they know are bad." That isn't what they've said at all, actually. Homan said everyone is on the table. I just feel like it matters. The details matter.
I think the details matter. And I think what Democrats have been by is arguing details. You always see it online. People go, well, actually, part of the policy that's the problem. I think that this woman should not be deported. Kids that voted for situations, but the idea that be deported is a fairly reasonable argument, and I think people can agree or disagree that she should be or not. But Democrats never went to, the horrible criminal who murdered Lake and Riley should not have been in the country, or that we shouldn't have open borders, or that you
Totally
get past that, we agree, and then you argue about the details. I think where the Democrats have been caught, anyway, it real the big picture. I mean, she couldn't even say about the trans issue. You can argue about the trans issue, and again, I'm ambivalent about it. Friends whose kids have transitioned, cases they worked out, some cases they haven't worked out. Well, you kind of have to approach that with sympathy or compassion. At the same time that you're willing to pay for a convicted murderer's transition with tax dollars, you just go fucking no, man, no.
Yeah.
Point.
On the immigration. Oh yeah, sorry. On the immigration thing, I wanted to point out. I'm so glad you brought that up. The Occupy Democrats on Instagram posted this picture of a little girl, and she's wearing a shirt, and it says "Birthplace Earth, Race Human, Politics Freedom, Religion Love." And I was struck by the fact that like Democrats are living in this fucking la not real world of like John Lennon's "Imagine All the People." Like, listen, I actually do agree that there's only one human race and that everything else is a construct. So you should treat people as you want to be treated. Your country or your birthplace, to think that countries aren't real. Other countries know that their country is real, and they will eat your lunch if you act like their interests are as important as American interests. So there is a wing of the Democratic Party that thinks having borders is racist. And when they speak, they sound fucking stupid. So to your point, what my argument would be is that Democrats can win the immigration argument by saying, we agree, we need strong immigration enforcement. And one of the best places to do that is to send billionaires that own companies that employ illegal immigrants to prison. That is the way to do it, is make the boogeyman the people that everyone hates already, the billionaires that are making a ton of money by suppressing wages, by hiring people who have nothing and living 20 in a house, so that they can go back and retire in El Salvador. They're going to work for 10 years, pocket their money, and go back and retire. And that's the argument. Not, oh, we need to let people in. It's humane. They're coming here. They're declaring asylum. Not declaring fucking asylum. It's for economic reasons, right? So get out of here. And That is the argument.
I think you're right. A political argument, if you polled Harris who employ illegal immigrants to make greater profit should be prosecuted in jail, have to be, if that's easily a 65% question. I mean, there's nobody going, well, there's nobody doing well actually with that. You'd be like, yeah, fuck them. I mean,
yeah.
And that's a policy, by the way, which goes to the 2016 Bernie thing. I always laugh is that, Hillary needed superdelegates, proclaim Democratic socialist who wasn't even a fucking registered Democrat in a Democratic primary. And that should have been a wake-up call. That should have been a real wake-up call. And it wasn't. It wasn't because and again, I think Trump in 2016, much different than this time. 2016 was the dog that caught the car.
Yeah.
He kind of pulled it inside straight. This time, the campaign was meticulously run, these things go, and decisive, and it was really clear they had a plan. And by the way, and I also think it's really clear they have a plan to govern this time. If anything else, it shows that Trump has a learning curve.
Scarily.
Learning curve. It's not like
the
Democrats, Biden Harris, which is essentially the same candidate. It's that same slightly left of center. Think Klein or Matt Iglesias calls it the indigo blob.
That might be Ezra Klein, but one of them. I don't remember.
But they're that indigo blob thing. It's kind of your generic Democrat, your generic corporate Democrat.
So how do you make sense of this then? In this year's election, there were 2 ballot initiatives to increase the minimum wage in California and Massachusetts, and both of them were rejected by voters.
Well, I think that both the same thing, people. I think the California ballot stuff is that we've been promised, again, I live in Los Angeles, we've been promised all this shit, and it pans out, and it all feels like a scam. In Los Angeles, we pass $1 billion additional tax and housing for the homeless, and they're costing like $800,000 a piece. High speed rail, which is never going to be built, was supposed to be finished by 2020. You can't go anywhere and do it, and it's going to be over $1 billion, over $100 billion. I mean, all this kind of crazy stuff, and I think that's what it was. It was like, you know what? Nah, fuck you. And the idea that on the Pod Save America podcast is that Hatton say what she would do different from Biden. She's so loyal. Get the fuck out of here with that.
Right. Yeah. Right. She's the one that put that knife in the back. You kidding?
And it's just like, and what it was somebody couldn't convince her. I think they did argue that we couldn't say she changed because that would only expose, lefty ideas that people didn't agree with. Well, people already thought that. So, right?
You frame those lefty ideas that are economic in the way that we've talked about, and that's a winning message. If you frame them in cultural bullshit things that I thought about this before, there's been a large debate now of how Democrats are scapegoating trans issues. I don't think it's scapegoating. I think what people are trying to say is it's a 20-80, not an 80-20 issue. You said, I think 2 episodes ago, the guy who mentored you was the one who first started the attacks of calling people liberal because a minority of people label themselves as liberal. And you could say your neighbor let his dog out of the yard. He's a liberal, right? It's a pejorative. It's the same thing with these niche identities that people they're trying to make them bigger than what they are. And what you're actually doing is pointing out the fact that you're aligning with the minority to the detriment to some people, to the detriment of the majority of people. Like, this doesn't make any fucking sense for me, though. This isn't normal majority behavior. It doesn't mean that they don't have a right to exist, but why are you forcing it down our throat? it's a counterculture behavior. It's not a cultural behavior.
I can kind of do a parallel argument, which I will immediately doing. Do that argument, or when that argument happens, that like everybody's seen video or clips or photos or stories about a magical male playing in a female sport, either when they couldn't in competition or as an injury, and always is, well, there's not a lot of them. Well, it's a rare it's a rare thing. In school shootings, well, it was only 4 kids, and you know, well, we really should have assault weapons because it only killed 10 kids this year. And you kind of go, what are you, fucking insane? Right? The average person will go, you are nuts.
Yes.
It's
I think
kind of
to your
argument.
point, you've said this before. You've said this before about 80-20s, and I'm going to say it in a more, layman's way, but it seems to me if what you're campaigning on doesn't pass the common sense test, you might want to shut the fuck up. And even if you are factually accurate, you may be right, but if it doesn't pass common sense, shut up about it.
Which is different from when something is a place of principle.
Right.
You can do that. Again, I always talk about my UFO thing. If your neighbor, but all he wants to talk about is UFOs, or that's how he defines himself, you're not going to talk to the neighbor. And, Democrats famously, there have been politicians who've been death penalty when it's been very popular, or pro-choice or pro-life when it's been, very unpopular. And they say, well, I'm doing this as a matter of my personal conviction. And if you are otherwise aligned with the electorate, actually, my first client in 80, so this gives you an idea how old I was. Now, I was 22, but not my first client, my first federal client, congressman who's still in office named Chris Smith, and a very strong labor, probably went for Harris, his district probably went for Harris, New Jersey, I think it's New Jersey 3 now, forever. And he is otherwise a labor moderate Democrat, except on the pro-life issue. Where he is, and because he comes at it from an honest place, people kind of forgive him on that. You can do
it says New Jersey's 4th.
And you can't see over my shoulder back there, but I've got the last print ad I did for his election in 80. I wrote, and it's really funny because it reads like fucking everything I write. And it was like, 40 years ago, me writing the thing. But you can do that, but you can't do and open borders, or you can't do harm reduction, or you can't do a bunch of these things. Because, people want to see like random crime by somebody who shouldn't be in the country, some dude shitting on the street, shooting up in the park. You find needles in the park. You can't walk the dog because it's like, you can't.
These are quality of life issues. And, it's funny because you brought up school shootings. I wanted to shift for a second. I wanted to share with you, the Texas legislature is going to be back in session in January. All of the legislators are kind of putting forward their bills that they're going to be pushing this session. One of which is a Texas bill for armed drones, armed with pepper spray and tasers at schools as a way of keeping schools safe. By the way, just as a side note, I assume the schools aren't actually in the hall, the drones aren't in the hallway, they're actually in the perimeter. If I go in without having a firearm visible, once I get in, how's the drone going to know that I have? If you aren't following the Twitter account Evil Mopac, Mopac is a freeway running through Texas, running through Austin, definitely follow it, because whoever runs that account said, this sounds like something a group of drunk dads suggested at a barbecue. It's like,
actually operates.
You know how we can fix it? Good question. Scarily, what if it's autonomous? That's even worse. Suddenly your kids are coming home from school tased and
it reminds me of, there's a great scene in RoboCop, the Peter Weller version, the
Yes.
where they had the automated cop prototype of it, and it malfunctions, and it shoots it puts one of the board members out the fucking window, and down they hit the cut. And
Totally.
it's one of the greatest lines in that's probably the best line in the movie, is that the CEO turns to the developer and he goes, "Dick, I'm very disappointed." You know, I mean, it's just the whole thing. Yeah, who's going to operate a drone inside a school, inside a hallway? Is a. I mean, I use drones for spots, and you need a level of sophistication, not to mention, your Wi-Fi signal and like drunk dads. It's drunk dad. It's like you can picture like guys or the three guys from King of the Hill conversation. That's a bit.
Exactly. Exactly. Another thing in Texas is there's a battle brewing. I don't know how much you follow Texas. Dave Phelan has been a longtime Speaker of the House. He's cut deals with Democrats to be chairs of key committees for their support to maintain his control of the House. He's being challenged now by actually a one-time ally now challenging him. Obviously, maybe the majority of Republicans don't like Dave Phelan because his deals with Democrats has prevented the Republican utopia that people want in Texas. So school vouchers have been held up by Democrats and stuff like that. I don't know. It'll be an interesting run. It'll be interesting to see if his opponent is Dan something. It'll be interesting if he can muster a big enough coalition to unseat that Democratic alliance that Dave Phelan has built together. Another state thing I wanted to ask you, a state in which you played this year, which is North Carolina. The state state Senate, they have a supermajority for another month or so. I saw that they are now pushing forward basically removing a ton of power from the incoming Democrats in a lean funding bill. I think it's Senate Bill 302, I think. Have you seen this at all?
It's bad. It's bad. That shit's bad. I mean, poison pilling stuff. I mean,
Yeah, you don't like the poison pills?
And again, I mean, the problem with poison pills and the problem with that kind of shit is that I think, again, and I'll do another bad analogy, which I'll immediately regret. It's like Democrats were going to get rid of the filibuster, and we're going to pack the Supreme Court. And my joke, I bust my balls with some of my Democratic friends. It's like, hey, by the way, just checking if you're still for packing the Supreme Court, adding 4 new members and ending the filibuster now. Just checking. And again, it's a stupid policy,
right?
Which I am against both. Probably you can argue for increasing the Supreme, but don't do that. I mean, don't do this because it's going to come back to bite you in the ass. And if you think it won't, you're a moron.
It's interesting. I don't know if we've ever talked about this before, but there's a great book called The Storm Before the Storm about the fall of the Roman Republic. And it ends, actually, I think, one of the last...
To you.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I read it then. Have you read it then? It's a great book.
Yeah.
And to your point, that is exactly how that 100 years or so of civil war that led to the Roman Empire and to Caesar being the first kind of emperor, that is exactly how it happened. It was a tit-for-tat approach towards collapse. It wasn't an one side destroyed the other. It was a tit-for-tat battle between entrenched interests and kind of more populists, of which actually Caesar was on the populist side.
By the way, that is not a comforting book to read.
No.
I mean,
how many times did you read a passage and you were like, holy shit, that's us?
Yeah. I mean, I'm an optimist and by the nature of my work, but that is not a comforting book to read. You kind of read it and you go, oh, fuck me. Right. I mean, it's
totally. So I'd like to ask you one more thing. I think for the last month, there has been a big, bright light shined on Democrats, the DNC, what's wrong with them. To your point about Democrats from, 08, 12, kind of throughout, believing that they were maybe invincible or it was on their side structurally. Where are the blind spots, if any, maybe there aren't any, that Republicans should actually be worrying about and that we should be paying attention to as the Trump administration comes in? What would be some signs that actually things aren't all hunky-dory for the Republicans?
A couple. and I think the first is the big one, is that necessarily have to deliver. Sure as shit better look like you're trying to deliver. People voted for change. If they don't get change, they're going to be really pissed off. Two, I think the economic stress. If you get a bunch of tariffs in, and all of a sudden everything is way more expensive than it was in office, you are going to get the shit beat out of you. I think which will happen, by the way, overstepping the cultural bounds that people from other countries who are murderers and torturers and rapists in our country is a fairly reasonable idea that you want to rip somebody who's been here for 10 years and taxes and doing their shit, and you're going to send them back to some place they don't even know anymore, is a different one. And the same thing with the trans thing, that saying, okay, we need to take a step back. We need to look at sensible, common sense things and approach this with compassion is a reasonable proposition. Recognizing, trans people. And so I think that you will see this cultural overreach be the blind spot. The best thing to do would be to avoid it or ignore it.
And to your point, you're talking about what the effect tariffs might have. We were talking before we started about this response that, forgive me, I don't remember her name, the new president of Mexico, her response to Trump. What's her name?
President Sheinbaum.
Sheinbaum, that's right. Yeah. Is she Jewish, by the way? I know there's a very large Jewish population in Mexico. Yeah. So I guess in a sense, my guess is that regardless of ideology, and I don't think Trump has an ideology really, regardless of that, however, even ideologues within the administration will be quickly pushed out if things economically turn because of tariffs, and they will find a way to declare victory and move on. And I think that's a bit of what, in my reading of Ms. Scheinbaum's letter, kind of hints at that, is like, yeah. It's not going to be in your economic interest to do these things. We can work together and find a better path forward. That's my sense.
I can't remember where I read it now, but fairly compelling argument that why do we import things? We can't do them as cheap here. So why do we import fentanyl? We can't do it as cheap here. The idea of and penalties to companies that kind of subsidize the other way on that, I have some validity, and I think will be very popular. Nobody's, that, for the state of Mexico, for the country of Mexico, they could be very popular partners, kind of rapprochement. But I don't want to kind of go too far into it, but the president of Mexico being forceful about it is smart politics.
And good for her country as well. I think that's a good way for her to start. Okay, we can start to wrap up. I wanted to ask you, did you see the news that they may have found DB Cooper? You remember DB Cooper from the
really?
skyjacking for $1 million? Yeah. I'll send you the Twitter link. But basically, the guy is now dead, but his 50-ish-year-old kids have come forward and said, we think our dad is DB Cooper. We found this parachute that is like the exact model that he requested. I'll send it to you, but I'm kind of getting goosebumps, man, because I actually, if you've ever read the book, what's the title? It's about DB Cooper. I read it and I was like, I hope this guy got away. But the book goes into the physics of how his body would have responded of jumping out of a jetliner once the wind hit him. But anyway, I'll send it to you. His kids basically put him on blast. And I guess there was some money that they had with it as well. It could be a Christmas miracle for the FBI. They might actually.
Yeah, you can probably find on there was a 70s pop kind of gimmick song called something about the search for him. Anyway, it's this kind of kitschy thing that I remember is as kind of a kid, you probably found.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I,
Yeah.
I hope it's true, man. I love that.
I do too. Oh my God. I hope that mystery's solved. I think that would be amazing. How cool would that be to find out that your dad might be one of the most famous skyjacking heist people in history as well? Like, I'd be a little pissed that my dad didn't share it with me.
So you made a good point, which will be the last thing I will babble about today. Walter Kern, who's a writer, author, he did for writing, which was the George Clooney movie about layoffs.
That's a great movie.
And he's a really interesting Democratic convention. He was one of the early people that said Harris is going to fail. It was the type that she's setting up. Prosecutor. Remember they were doing prosecutor? She was a prosecutor, right?
Yeah.
And she said,
Yeah.
don't root for prosecutors. They root for outlaws.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's smart.
And that's smart.
Who do you like better, Jesse James or, the guy who was hunting Jesse James, you know?
Yeah.
What I mean? Yeah, Elliot Ness. Exactly.
Elliot
Great
Ness or Al
example. Are
Capone.
you rooting for Al Capone? Or are you rooting for Elliot Ness? You know what I mean? Yeah. It's something built into us as Americans. We're just like Aussies. We're a country full of convicts in a way. You know what I mean?
And, what's really interesting is that the movie The Untouchables and the TV show walk a delicate line that, ostensibly you were rooting for Elliot Ness. Movie, it's like, who did you want to see? The ones with Kevin Costner or the ones with Robert De Niro and a baseball bat? Come on, right?
Right. And to your point, you've said this before about Sean Connery. If they hit one of ours, we put one of theirs in the ground or something like that. In order to make the good guys more likable, they actually made them more gangster-like.
And my current point, and that's what we root for. I mean, again, country convicts. We like that shit.
And Trump had a huge increase in popularity once he was indicted, once he had his mugshot. You go anywhere, any Trump thing, that picture, shirts, like everyone rallied to his defense or his support because of that, not in spite of it.
Savita,
all right, well,
Savita, who's Trump's general consultant, was on the David Axelrod's the Axe Files, and Axelrod is a really interesting, smart guy who has also been kind of, I will say, pushed out of Democratic circles because of his. So I think Savita talked about it, is that like Trump won the nomination when they got indicted. All of a sudden, all this rushed to him.
Yeah. Yeah, even before that, maybe DeSantis or Nikki Haley could have taken the nomination, but they couldn't compete with that. Yeah. All right, my friend. Well, happy Thanksgiving to you and yours, and I'll see you next week. All right. Bye. Well, there you have it. I think, I think we're reaching the end of the post-mortem on the DNC. I think we've made some pretty compelling observations about what me as a layman and Chris as a professional, what we see as the contributing factors for the election results. I think we've also laid the groundwork of how to think about politics moving forward. If you're entering fantasy elect contests, if you're going to be picking a winner, I would be thinking, I think Annie Mott is the name of the author of Bird by Bird, which is a great book if you've never read it. She said, and she's very Christian, and she says in an interview that a good friend of hers who is I'm going to say a Catholic priest, but I'm not 100% sure that is Catholic, said to her, Annie, I think her name is Annie, actually, not think about it. Annie, if God hates all the same people as you, you've made God in your image. And Chris said something today. He was talking about, which candidate said, fuck you to the right people. And he said this in response to my statement about, for the immigration issue, going after poor people, that's one path. And that path works if the other side isn't going after the immigration issue. The other path, and I think the winning path, is going after the billionaires, the companies that are intentionally seeking out illegal immigrants to exploit their labor and to suppress American labor or suppress American wages and American labor. And when Chris said, yeah, who would you rather say fuck you to? It made me think of something I think this election showed. And we talked today about whether Trump was an anomaly or not. I actually don't think so. I think Biden in 2020 was the anomaly. I think this era that we're in is actually a populist Trump era, at least since 2016 to now. A lot has been said about Trump gives you permission to, or many Democrats have said Trump gives Republican voters permission to hate. I don't think that's what it is. I think what it is he hates the same people they hate. And I don't actually, I'm going to rephrase that. He supports their anger and hatred towards the same people. It isn't, sometimes there are scapegoats within that, but what they're really angry about is these structural things. So when he says he's going to stop these things from happening, he's giving them a way to say, yeah, fuck these billionaires. Ironically, like I've pointed out, I don't actually think that I don't trust it because there are now way too many billionaires that are in positions of power. If you really wanted to throw Molotov cocktails, what you do is you would find a former head of a union. There are several, and you would put that person in charge of the Department of Labor, and you would stack all of these departments. You would put Lena Khan. You would empower Lena Khan even more. You would empower the Commerce Department. All of these things, not to end for what Americans want. I think is not just these people in power, because the Biden administration did a lot of this. But when the Biden administration would lose in court, they would accept it and go back and lick their wounds. What Americans want is that you don't accept it. They want a president that's going to tell the Supreme Court to go fuck itself and figure out how they're going to tell the president what to do. That's a very different thing, especially now the Supreme Court has ruled that the president has immunity. I think the president, even now in the remaining days, there are things I would do if I was Biden that would completely upend the political system and really stick it to some people and fight and show the American people we actually have taken the gloves off, because it's important who you allow to disrupt. If you just allow people to disrupt that want to tear down institutions and to secure power for people who already have power, that's one thing. If you want to empower people, disruptors that are going to shake up institutions and reform institutions to protect the power of the majority of the people against the entrenched interests of the rich and the minority that is using their power and wealth to accrue more power and wealth, that's a winning strategy. All that to say, by the way, tomorrow is Thanksgiving. I saw two things on Twitter that really bothered me. Many people said, hey, you have to surround yourself with people for your own reasons that you feel comfortable with. And I think that is true. If somebody doesn't like me, I don't want them to hang out with me. But I read a thing about a person wrote on Twitter that they have an elderly neighbor, a widower. I believe it was a widower who they normally will get together, drink a beer, hang out. They both really like doing it. They both enjoy each other's company. And the Twitter post said, tonight, his neighbor came over. His neighbor was a Trump voter. He was not, and asked to hang out, have a beer. And he said no, because he's a Trump supporter. Second thing I read was a Reddit post about a gentleman who said his three daughters live in Washington, I think Seattle. They voted however they voted. My understanding is that they were Kamala supporters. Maybe his wife as well, but he voted for Trump. And his daughters are now cutting off ties and refusing to come to Thanksgiving dinner because of how that person voted. I've said in posts on the newsletter and on LinkedIn and other posts, if the ideologies that separate us are small ideologies, meaning just small, like party affiliation, who we vote for, rather than the bigger ideology that we are all in the same country, we're all neighbors, we are all Americans because we share certain American ideals. And you might believe somebody doesn't share those ideals, and maybe they do or they don't, at least not the way you define those ideals. But what is more important is that it becomes a smaller and smaller circle, which makes you more and more in the minority. Most people, whether you voted the same way or not, a neighbor will participate in a food train when you welcome a baby to your family, or when you suffer a loss and lose a loved one, or you're sick. I've seen it. And nobody ever asks, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Who'd you vote for? They just know you're their neighbor. So if you have an elderly neighbor, any neighbor who you used to have a social relationship with, I encourage you, I'm not going to enable your necessity for your own mental health. If your mental health isn't strong enough to look beyond somebody else's vote as to whether or not they deserve your time and attention, maybe you were never friends with them to begin with. Because there are plenty of people, I don't agree with their politics. Some of them, I think their politics are even dangerous. But the people themselves, I know them, and they aren't dangerous. They're good people. On both sides, actually. That's one of the benefits of starting Fantasy Elect, and my job is that I get to talk to people across the spectrum. If you talk long enough, you see way more similarities than you do differences. So that's my Thanksgiving message. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. It is a uniquely American experience. Our Canadian cousins to the north celebrate it, although they celebrate it at the wrong time in October. But it is a uniquely American experience. And if you think about that story, it is an experience of people with very different ideologies, very different backgrounds, very different belief systems, realizing that the only way to survive is together. Now, the rest of that story is that we ended up slaughtering and destroying that culture, which is kind of a negative turn, but maybe we did that because we stopped seeing them as our neighbors. So let's continue to see our neighbors as we see ourselves, with the same grace, because we're all flawed, we have different beliefs, and everybody's seeing the world through their own eyes. Anyway, that's it. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you, and Chris and I will be back next week. All my best to you and yours.
Draft picks in the Senate, game on the floor. Campaign slogans echo final scores. Analysis deep as the trench warfare set. We break it down, no sweat, no net. Violence and touchdowns, where's your bet? Candidate playbooks, lines we set. Irreverent and free, we call it out. Competition fierce, ain't no doubt. Blitz and a Hail Mary pass. Legislation touch